On a cool, breezy autumn afternoon, the golden leaves swirled around as Judge Evelyn Carter drove her old but well-maintained sedan down a quiet suburban road. At 82 years old, Evelyn had lived through decades of change, some good, some painful, but she remained resilient and fiercely independent. Though her hands weren't as steady as they once were and her pace was slower now, she still loved driving herself wherever she needed to go. It gave her a sense of freedom, something she cherished after spending most of her life fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. Today, Evelyn had just wrapped up a community event where she'd spoken about her experiences growing up during the civil rights movement. She'd shared stories of marching alongside legends like Martin Luther King Jr., sitting in crowded rooms debating landmark cases, and standing firm against systemic racism, even when it felt like the whole world was against her. The crowd had listened intently, clapping warmly at the end of her speech. As she left the venue, Evelyn felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her work continued to inspire younger generations. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the road ahead. Evelyn hummed softly to herself, enjoying the peaceful drive home. But as she approached an intersection, the tranquility was suddenly shattered. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, startling her out of her calm reverie. Her heart sank slightly, not because she thought she'd done anything wrong, but because she knew what this could mean. Evelyn pulled over carefully, turning on her hazard lights before bringing the car to a stop on the side of the road. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what might come next. Over the years, she'd heard countless stories from friends and family about unnecessary traffic stops targeting black drivers. Some called it driving while black. Evelyn had always hoped such prejudice wouldn't touch her personally, given her stature and accomplishments, but she wasn't naive enough to think she was immune. A young police officer approached her window, his posture rigid and his expression stern. His name tag read Riggs, and he carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Without so much as a polite greeting, he leaned down and peered into the car, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Evelyn. "Do you know why I stopped you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone clipped and impatient. Evelyn blinked up at him, meeting his gaze with a calmness that masked her inner turmoil. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong." Officer Riggs crossed his arms over his chest, clearly unimpressed by her response. "Your taillight is out," he stated matter-of-factly. "That's a safety hazard." Evelyn frowned slightly, glancing at her dashboard. She'd checked her lights earlier that day. They were all working perfectly fine. Still, she didn't want to argue. Instead, she offered a solution. "If you'd like, we can step out and test them together," she suggested, her voice steady and respectful. "I assure you everything should be in order." But instead of agreeing or investigating further, Riggs bristled at her suggestion. To him, it sounded like defiance rather than cooperation. He straightened up, his jaw tightening. "Ma'am, I'm the one asking the questions here," he snapped. "Now please hand over your license and registration." Evelyn sighed inwardly, feeling a familiar pang of frustration. She reached slowly into her purse, careful not to make any sudden movements that might alarm the already tense officer. As she retrieved her documents, she couldn't help but notice how dismissive he seemed, how quick he was to assume she was guilty of something without evidence. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered such behavior, but it never failed to sting. When she handed over her papers, Riggs barely glanced at them before launching into another round of accusations. "You people really need to pay more attention to the rules," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Evelyn to hear. Her back stiffened ever so slightly at his words. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone sharper than before. "What exactly do you mean by you people?" Riggs faltered for a moment, caught off guard by her directness, but he quickly recovered, brushing off her question with a shrug. "Just saying," he said vaguely, avoiding eye contact. "Folks need to take responsibility for their actions." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, taking in his youthful face and the badge pinned proudly to his uniform. She wondered if he realized how much harm his attitude could cause, or if he even cared. For someone who claimed to uphold the law, he seemed disturbingly comfortable wielding it as a weapon, against those he deemed less worthy. Despite her rising indignation, Evelyn chose to remain composed. She'd learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything. Patience and reason were far more effective tools. "Officer," she began gently, "I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you, I haven't broken any laws today. My vehicle is in perfect condition and I've been driving safely. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Riggs didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away, muttering something unintelligible into his radio. Evelyn watched him, closely, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The same oppressive forces that had tried to silence her ancestors were rearing their ugly head once again. Yet here she was, a woman who had risen above every obstacle placed in her path, being treated like a criminal simply for existing. As Riggs continued his tirade, oblivious to the storm brewing within Evelyn, neither of them noticed a passerby, filming the entire exchange on their phone. Within minutes, the video would spread like wildfire online, igniting a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. But for now, Evelyn sat quietly in her car, determined to face this challenge with grace and dignity, just as she had done countless times before. As the confrontation between Judge Evelyn Carter and Officer Daniel Riggs continued, the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Evelyn sat calmly behind the wheel of her sedan, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Though her outward demeanor remained composed, inside, she felt a storm brewing, a mix of frustration, disbelief, and sadness. She had lived through far worse moments in her lifetime, but this encounter struck a particularly raw nerve. It wasn't just about being pulled over for no reason. It was about the blatant disrespect and prejudice underlying the officer's actions. Officer Riggs, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the weight of the situation. He stood beside Evelyn's car, tapping his flashlight against his palm, as if trying to assert dominance. His tone shifted from dismissive to outright condescending. "Listen, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with impatience. "We don't have time for excuses here. You were breaking the law, plain and simple. Now, unless you want this to escalate further, I suggest you cooperate." Evelyn raised an eyebrow at his words. Cooperate? She had been nothing but cooperative since the moment he pulled her over. She hadn't raised her voice, argued, or resisted in any way. In fact, she'd gone above and beyond by offering to test her taillights right then and there. Yet here he was, accusing her of making excuses while refusing to acknowledge that his entire premise for stopping her was based on a lie. "Excuse me, officer," Evelyn replied, her voice steady but firm. "I understand your position, but I must point out that my taillight is not, and has never been, out. If you'd like, we can verify that together. However, I find it troubling that you're so quick to accuse without evidence." Riggs frowned, clearly irritated by her persistence. To him, Evelyn wasn't just an elderly woman questioning his authority. She represented something larger, something he couldn't quite articulate but instinctively resented. Her calm confidence unsettled him, as though she knew something he didn't. And perhaps she did. After all, Evelyn had spent decades navigating spaces where people doubted her abilities simply because of the color of her skin. She had faced judges, lawyers, and politicians who underestimated her, only to leave them speechless with her wisdom and poise. But Riggs wasn't seasoned enough to recognize these subtleties. All he saw was someone challenging his power. "Well, maybe the light was working when you checked earlier," Riggs shot back, grasping at straws. "But it doesn't mean it won't go out later. Better safe than sorry, right?" Evelyn suppressed a sigh. The logic, or lack thereof, in his argument was almost laughable. Still, she chose not to engage in a pointless debate. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Officer Riggs," she began, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made him pause. "I've been driving for over 60 years. In all that time, I've prided myself on following the rules of the road. I've also seen firsthand how certain individuals are disproportionately targeted under the guise of safety. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about your intentions here." For a brief second, Riggs looked taken aback. He hadn't expected this mild-mannered woman to call him out so directly. But instead of reflecting on her words, he doubled down, growing more defensive. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he insisted, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "If everyone followed the rules like they're supposed to, we wouldn't have problems like this." Evelyn nodded slowly as if considering his statement. Then with a soft chuckle she said, "You know, I've heard that line before. Just doing my job. It's what segregationists used to say when they enforced Jim Crow laws. It's what bystanders claimed during the civil rights marches. And now, here we are again, decades later, hearing those same words used to justify behavior that feels, well, awfully familiar." Her comment hit Riggs like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. How could this elderly woman possibly compare modern-day policing to the horrors of the past? Surely, she was exaggerating. Wasn't she? Before he could gather his thoughts, Evelyn continued, her voice taking on a reflective tone. "I grew up in a world where being black meant facing obstacles at every turn. I couldn't drink from the same water fountains, attend the same schools, or even walk freely without fear of repercussion. But I refused to let that define me. I worked hard, studied harder, and eventually became a judge, one of the first black women to serve on the Supreme Court. Do you know why I share this with you?" Riggs shook his head, unsure whether to interrupt or stay silent. Evelyn didn't wait for him to decide. "Because I want you to understand that people like me have fought tooth and nail for equality. We've endured unimaginable hardships to ensure that future generations wouldn't have to face the same injustices. Yet here I am today, sitting in my car, being treated as if none of that matters, as if my worth is determined solely by the color of my skin." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Riggs looked genuinely conflicted, as though he were grappling with emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. But just as quickly, his defensiveness returned. He straightened his posture, clutching his flashlight tighter. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what kind of agenda you're pushing, but I'm not here to debate history. This is about the present, and right now you're wasting my time." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Am I?" she asked softly. "Or are you wasting mine?" The question seemed to catch Riggs off guard. He blinked rapidly, searching for a response, but Evelyn didn't give him the chance. She reached into her purse once more, pulling out her phone. "Since you seem determined to proceed with this stop despite the lack of evidence," she said, her tone deliberate, "I think it's only fair that others bear witness to how this unfolds." Riggs frowned, confused by her sudden action. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Recording our interaction," Evelyn replied matter-of-factly. "It's my right as a citizen, unless, of course, you object." For the first time since the stop began, Riggs hesitated. He glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how precarious his position had become. A traffic stop that should have been routine was spiraling into something far more complicated and potentially damaging for him. Yet pride prevented him from backing down. Instead, he muttered something about knowing your rights and retreated to his patrol car, presumably to run her information through the system. Unbeknownst to either of them, a passerby standing nearby had already captured much of the exchange on their phone. The video, shaky but clear enough to show Riggs' dismissive attitude and Evelyn's dignified responses, would soon make its way online. Within hours, millions of viewers would watch the clip, sharing it across social media platforms and sparking outrage. Comments flooded in, praising Evelyn's composure while condemning Riggs' behavior. News outlets picked up the story, turning what had started as a minor traffic stop into a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. Back at the scene, Evelyn waited patiently, her mind racing with thoughts about the bigger picture. She knew this incident was unlikely to change the world overnight, but it could serve as a catalyst, a reminder that progress required vigilance and courage. As Riggs returned to her window, still visibly flustered, Evelyn met his gaze with unwavering determination. Whatever happened next, she vowed to handle it with grace and integrity, proving once again that true strength lies not in domination, but in resilience. As the tension between Judge Evelyn Carter and Officer Daniel Riggs reached its peak, the quiet suburban street transformed into a stage for something much larger than either of them had anticipated. Riggs, still fumbling with his radio and trying to regain control of the situation, was visibly unsettled. His earlier confidence had begun to crack under the weight of Evelyn's calm yet pointed words. He couldn't quite place why this elderly woman unnerved him so much. Was it her unshakable composure? Her ability to articulate truths that cut straight to the heart of the matter? Or perhaps it was the growing realization that he might have made a grave mistake in pulling her over without cause. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat quietly in her car, her mind working methodically. She knew she could reveal her identity as a former Supreme Court judge at any moment, but she hesitated. Doing so would undoubtedly end the confrontation quickly. It would force Riggs to back down and apologize, but it also felt like taking the easy way out. If she wanted to truly make an impact, she needed to let this play out naturally. She wanted Riggs and anyone watching to see the absurdity of the situation. An elderly black woman being harassed by a young officer who hadn't even bothered to verify his claims before escalating the stop. Riggs eventually returned to Evelyn's window, holding her license and registration in one hand while clutching his flashlight tightly in the other. "Everything checks out," he muttered reluctantly, avoiding eye contact. "But I still need to issue a warning about your taillight." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of disbelief and amusement. "A warning?" she repeated, her tone light but laced with irony. "For a taillight that isn't broken?" Riggs shifted uncomfortably, gripping his flashlight even tighter. "Like I said earlier, better safe than sorry. You never know when something might go wrong." Evelyn sighed softly, shaking her head. "Officer Riggs," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Do you realize how often people like me hear those exact same excuses? Better safe than sorry. Just following procedure. These phrases become shields for actions rooted in bias rather than fact. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Riggs opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. He wasn't prepared for this kind of conversation. Not here, not now. All he wanted was to finish the stop and move on with his day. But Evelyn wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. She leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Let me tell you something else," she continued, her voice steady and commanding. "I've dedicated my entire life to fighting for justice. I've argued cases in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against me simply because of who I am. And yet here I am today, sitting in my car, being treated as if none of that matters. As if decades of work can be erased by someone who doesn't take the time to look beyond their assumptions." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a brief moment, Riggs looked genuinely conflicted, as though he were wrestling with emotions he couldn't fully process. But pride quickly took over, and he stiffened, attempting to regain his authority. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said again, though his voice lacked conviction. "If everyone cooperated and followed the rules, we wouldn't have these issues." Evelyn chuckled softly, a sound both warm and sharp. "Ah, yes. Everyone cooperates, and yet somehow it's always people who look like me who end up facing the consequences. Isn't that interesting?" Before Riggs could respond, distant sirens interrupted the conversation. Another police car arrived on the scene, its lights flashing as it pulled up behind Riggs's vehicle. Out stepped Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a seasoned officer with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Unlike Riggs, Hale carried himself with a sense of purpose tempered by experience. As he approached the scene, his eyes scanned the situation, immediately noticing the palpable tension between Riggs and the elderly driver. Hale glanced at Riggs first, then turned his attention to Evelyn. Something about her struck him as familiar, a dignified presence that commanded respect. He tapped Riggs lightly on the shoulder. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone firm but measured. Riggs stammered, clearly flustered by the sudden arrival of his superior. "Sir, I pulled her over for a busted taillight, but she's been uncooperative and argumentative." Evelyn raised a hand gently, cutting him off before he could continue. "Lieutenant," she began, addressing Hale directly, "may I clarify? My taillight is not and has never been out. Officer Riggs accused me of breaking the law based on false pretenses, and has spent the last several minutes lecturing me about rules and safety without providing any evidence to support his claims. Hale frowned, glancing between Evelyn and Riggs. Something didn't add up. Turning back to Evelyn, he asked politely, "Ma'am, may I see your license and registration?" Evelyn handed over the documents wordlessly, watching as Hale studied them closely. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the name. Judge Evelyn Carter. The pieces clicked into place instantly. Hale had read about her landmark, rulings, attended seminars where her decisions were discussed, and even quoted her opinions in training sessions. Here she was, sitting calmly in her car, enduring a traffic stop that should never have happened. Hale cleared his throat, stepping closer to Evelyn's window. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, tipping his hat slightly. "I apologize deeply for this misunderstanding. Please allow me to rectify the situation." Evelyn nodded graciously, accepting his apology with a small smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your professionalism." Turning to Riggs, Hale's demeanor shifted sharply. Gone was the calm, composed officer. In his place stood a figure radiating authority and disapproval. "Officer Riggs," he barked, his voice low but sharp. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" Riggs shook his head, looking increasingly uneasy. "No, sir." "Should I?" Hale sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is Judge Evelyn Carter, former Supreme Court Justice, civil rights icon, one of the most respected figures in American legal history. And you've been treating her like... He trailed off, unable to find the right words. The color drained from Riggs's face as the weight of his actions sank in. He stared at Evelyn, wide-eyed and speechless, finally realizing the magnitude of his error, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the scene, drawn by the commotion. Phones were out, capturing every moment of the interaction. Among them was a young woman named Jessica, who had filmed the initial exchange between Evelyn and Riggs. Her video had already gone viral online, sparking outrage and drawing national attention to the incident. Reporters weren't far behind, arriving within minutes to document the unfolding drama. As cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward Evelyn, she remained unfazed. This wasn't the first time she'd found herself at the center of controversy, nor would it be the last. With Lieutenant Hale standing beside her, offering a protective presence, she addressed the growing audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and clear, "what happened here today is not unique. It's a reflection of a broader issue, one that requires our collective effort to address. While I appreciate the Lieutenant's apology, true change will come only when we hold ourselves accountable and challenge the biases that perpetuate injustice." Her words resonated deeply, earning applause from the crowd and nods of agreement from bystanders. Even Riggs, standing awkwardly to the side, seemed to grasp the significance of the moment. Though humiliated, he couldn't deny the truth in Evelyn's message. As the scene wound down and Evelyn prepared to leave, she offered one final piece of advice to Riggs. "Young man," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "you have the power to make a difference, to choose empathy over assumption, understanding over judgment. Don't waste it." With that, she drove away, leaving behind a community stirred to action and a young officer forced to confront the consequences of his choices. The days following the traffic stop were nothing short of a whirlwind for Judge Evelyn Carter. What had started as an ordinary drive home had spiraled into a national conversation about racial profiling, police accountability, and systemic injustice. The viral video of her encounter with Officer Daniel Riggs spread like wildfire across social media platforms, sparking outrage, admiration, and heated debates. News outlets clamored to cover the story, portraying Evelyn not just as a victim of discrimination but as a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of prejudice. Evelyn, however, remained unfazed by the sudden spotlight. She had spent decades navigating high-pressure situations, arguing landmark cases before packed courtrooms, standing firm against powerful adversaries and breaking barriers in spaces where she was often the only black woman present. This latest chapter in her life felt familiar yet profoundly significant. It wasn't about her personal vindication. It was about using this moment to shine a light on issues that had plagued society for generations. Meanwhile, Officer Riggs found himself at the center of a firestorm. The backlash was swift and merciless. Social media users dissected every word he'd said during the stop, highlighting his dismissive tone, baseless accusations, and apparent lack of professionalism. Memes mocking him circulated widely, while hashtags like "Justice for Judge Carter" trended nationwide. Calls for his termination poured in from activists, community leaders, and even some fellow officers who believed his actions reflected poorly on the force. Internally, Riggs faced mounting pressure as well. Lieutenant Marcus Hale wasted no time, launching a formal investigation into the incident. He reviewed body camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and examined Riggs's record for patterns of misconduct. What he uncovered painted a troubling picture. Riggs had been involved in multiple complaints alleging racial bias during traffic stops, though none had resulted in disciplinary action due to insufficient evidence. This case, however, was different. With the video going viral and Judge Carter's prominence amplifying the stakes, there was no room for leniency. As the investigation unfolded, Riggs struggled to defend himself. In private meetings with superiors, he tried to downplay the severity of his actions, insisting that he'd simply been doing his job. But his excuses rang hollow, especially when confronted with the undeniable facts. His supervisor, Captain Laura Mendez, delivered a scathing rebuke during one particularly tense meeting. "You don't get to hide behind procedure when your behavior perpetuates harm," she told him bluntly. "What you did wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. You disrespected a legend and embarrassed this department. Now we're paying the price." Publicly, Riggs issued a statement through the police union, expressing regret for any misunderstanding and claiming that he hadn't recognized Judge Carter's identity at the time of the stop. While some sympathetic voices argued that the scrutiny was excessive, most dismissed his apology as insincere and inadequate. For many, it underscored the very problem they were protesting: officers deflecting responsibility rather than taking accountability. Amid the chaos surrounding Riggs, Evelyn seized the opportunity to amplify her message. She held a press conference outside the courthouse where she once presided, a grand, imposing building that stood as a testament to justice achieved despite overwhelming odds. Surrounded by civil rights advocates, legal scholars, and members of marginalized communities, Evelyn addressed the nation with characteristic poise and conviction. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "This isn't about one officer or one traffic stop. It's about a system that continues to devalue the lives and contributions of people of color. It's about the countless individuals who endure similar indignities daily without the privilege of having their stories heard, and it's about the urgent need for reform, not just within law enforcement but across all institutions that shape our society." Her words resonated deeply, striking a chord with audiences far beyond the courthouse steps. Parents shared her speech with their children, hoping to inspire them to stand up against injustice. Educators incorporated her remarks into classroom discussions about racism and equality. Activists rallied around her call for change, organizing protests and petitions demanding accountability and transparency. One of the most impactful moments came when Evelyn recounted specific examples of systemic racism she'd witnessed throughout her career. She spoke of young black defendants sentenced disproportionately harshly compared to their white counterparts. She described how women of color were often excluded from juries under dubious pretenses, and she highlighted the persistent disparities in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities that kept marginalized communities trapped in cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. "These aren't abstract concepts," she emphasized. "They're real-life obstacles that millions of people face every single day. And until we confront them head-on, true equality will remain out of reach." Her speech inspired immediate action. Local lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling in policing, mandating implicit bias training for officers, and creating independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Community organizations launched initiatives to educate citizens about their rights during traffic stops and other encounters with law enforcement. Even corporations joined the movement, pledging to support diversity and inclusion efforts both internally and externally. But perhaps the most poignant response came from Riggs himself, or rather, what followed after his initial denial. As the investigation progressed and the weight of public opinion bore down on him, Riggs began to reflect on his actions. Initially defensive, he gradually became more introspective, grappling with uncomfortable truths about his own biases. During a counseling session arranged by the department, he admitted to harboring stereotypes about black drivers being more likely to break laws, a revelation that shocked even him. "It's like I didn't even realize I thought that way," he confessed to the counselor. "I never meant to hurt anyone, but I see now how my assumptions led me to treat Judge Carter unfairly. I let my own fears and prejudices cloud my judgment, and that's not okay." Though his admission came too late to salvage his reputation, it marked a turning point in his personal journey. Riggs agreed to participate in sensitivity training programs and volunteered to mentor rookie officers on the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of race or background. While many remained skeptical of his sincerity, others saw it as a step toward redemption, a reminder that growth is possible, even for those who make grave mistakes. For Evelyn, the entire ordeal reinforced her belief in the power of perseverance and grace. Despite the challenges she'd faced, she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into creating meaningful change, proving once again that her legacy extended far beyond the courtroom. As she drove home from the press conference, she reflected on the words she'd spoken earlier. True justice isn't given, it's earned, and it begins with each of us choosing to do better. With that thought lingering in her mind, Evelyn smiled softly, knowing that the fight was far from over, but neither was she. The weeks following the traffic stop and press conference brought a wave of transformation that rippled far beyond the small suburban street where it all began. Officer Daniel Riggs, once confident in his authority, now found himself at the mercy of public opinion and internal investigations. The spotlight on him grew harsher with each passing day, as news outlets continued to dissect his actions and social media users relentlessly criticized his behavior. For someone who had always prided himself on being just a cop doing his job, Riggs was unprepared for the avalanche of consequences that followed. The Internal Affairs Department conducted a thorough review of Riggs' conduct, digging deep into his history of traffic stops, interactions with minority drivers, and past complaints filed against him. What they uncovered painted a troubling pattern. Riggs had disproportionately targeted Black and Hispanic drivers during routine patrols, often citing vague reasons like suspicious behavior or vehicle defects, without substantial evidence. While these incidents hadn't garnered much attention before, the viral video of his encounter with Judge Evelyn Carter forced authorities to take them seriously. Lieutenant Marcus Hale led the investigation, determined to hold Riggs accountable. During one particularly tense meeting, Hale confronted Riggs with irrefutable data showing disparities in how he handled different racial groups. "You stopped twice as many Black drivers as white ones last year alone," Hale said sternly, sliding a report across the table. "And guess what? None of those stops resulted in significant charges. This isn't coincidence, it's bias." Riggs sat silently, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. He knew there was no escaping the truth this time. His earlier attempts to justify his actions, claiming ignorance of Judge Carter's identity or insisting he'd acted out of concern for safety, had fallen flat. The court of public opinion had already sentenced him, and now the official inquiry seemed poised to deliver its verdict. In the end, the decision was unanimous. Riggs was suspended indefinitely pending further disciplinary action. The announcement sent shockwaves through the police force, serving as both a warning and a wake-up call to other officers. Captain Laura Mendez made sure to emphasize the gravity of the situation during a department-wide briefing. "This is not just about Riggs," she said firmly. addressing a room full of uniformed officers. It's about holding ourselves to a higher standard. If we don't, we risk losing the trust of the very communities we're sworn to protect. While Riggs faced professional ruin, Evelyn Carter became a beacon of hope and inspiration for millions. Her dignified response to the incident resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Social media users shared her story alongside messages of gratitude, calling her a living legend whose courage reminded everyone of the importance of standing up against injustice. Even late-night talk show hosts paid tribute to her, joking about how Riggs must have regretted picking on someone who could argue circles around him in court. Evelyn didn't let the praise go to her head, though. Instead, she used her newfound platform to push for systemic change. She partnered with civil rights organizations to draft legislation aimed at curbing racial profiling in law enforcement, dubbed the Accountability and Equity Act. The proposed bill included provisions for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct, and stricter penalties for officers found guilty of discriminatory practices. Evelyn traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, town halls, and legislative hearings to rally support for the measure. One such event took place in Washington, D.C., where Evelyn addressed a packed auditorium filled with activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens eager to see change. Standing behind a podium adorned with the words, "Justice for All," she delivered a stirring speech that left the audience spellbound. "We cannot afford to wait another generation for progress," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "Too many lives have been lost. Too many dreams shattered because of systems designed to exclude rather than include. But I believe in the power of collective action. Together, we can dismantle these barriers brick by brick until every person, regardless of race, gender, or background, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Her words ignited a fire in those present, prompting spontaneous applause and chants of "Justice for All." Lawmakers listened intently, recognizing the urgency of the moment. Within months, several states introduced versions of the Accountability and Equity Act in laws, with bipartisan support driving momentum forward. Back in her hometown, Evelyn worked closely with local leaders to implement reforms at the grassroots level. She spearheaded workshops for police officers, teaching them about implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. At first, some officers resisted, viewing the training as unnecessary or even accusatory. But Evelyn approached the task with patience and empathy, sharing personal anecdotes and encouraging open dialogue. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. One officer, a veteran named Detective Lisa Monroe, credited Evelyn with changing her perspective entirely. "I've been on the force for 20 years, and I thought I understood what fairness meant," Monroe admitted during a panel discussion. "But Judge Carter helped me realize that true fairness requires constant self-reflection and a willingness to learn. She taught us that policing isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about building trust." As positive changes took root locally, Evelyn also turned her attention to broader societal issues. She collaborated with educators to develop curricula focused on civil rights history, ensuring future generations would grow up aware of the struggles and triumphs that shaped modern America. She met with corporate executives, urging them to prioritize diversity and inclusion within their ranks. And she mentored young lawyers, inspiring them to pursue careers dedicated to fighting for justice. Despite the progress, Evelyn remained acutely aware that the fight was far from over. Racism and inequality were deeply entrenched in society, requiring sustained effort to dismantle fully. Still, she refused to let cynicism dampen her spirit. Every small victory, whether it was a new policy enacted or a child inspired to make a difference, fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. For Riggs, the fallout proved equally transformative, if less redemptive. Stripped of his badge and ostracized by former colleagues, he struggled to find employment in law enforcement. Some suggested he leave the field altogether, but Riggs clung to the belief that he could still contribute positively. He enrolled in community college, studying criminal justice with a focus on ethics and accountability. Though many doubted his sincerity, others saw his efforts as proof that redemption was possible, even for those who had caused harm. Ultimately, the incident served as a turning point for both individuals and institutions. It exposed flaws in policing practices while highlighting the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. For Evelyn Carter, it reinforced her lifelong mission to create a more equitable world. And for Officer Riggs, it marked the beginning of a long journey toward understanding and healing, a reminder that even in moments of failure, growth remains within reach. Months had passed since the fateful traffic stop that turned Judge Evelyn Carter's quiet drive home into a national reckoning on racial injustice. The story of her encounter with Officer Daniel Riggs continued to resonate deeply, sparking conversations in households, classrooms, and boardrooms across the country. What began as an isolated incident evolved into a catalyst for change, a moment that reminded people of both the progress society had made and the work still left to do. For Evelyn, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though she carried the weight of her newfound role as a symbol of resilience. She resumed her daily routines, tending to her garden, reading legal journals, and mentoring young lawyers, but her presence loomed larger than ever in public discourse. Her words from rallies, press conferences, and interviews echoed in the hearts of activists fighting for equality. Yet, despite the accolades and admiration, Evelyn remained grounded, refusing to let fame overshadow her purpose. "I've always believed that true legacy isn't measured by titles or awards," she once told a reporter during a rare sit-down interview. "It's about the impact you leave behind, the lives you touch, the doors you open, the barriers you help break down. If my story can inspire even one person to stand up against injustice, then I've done my part." Her humility only deepened the respect others felt for her. People marveled at how someone who had faced so much adversity could still exude such grace and optimism. Friends often joked that Evelyn's strength came from the same determination that got her through law school while raising 2 children alone, or the resilience that allowed her to argue landmark cases before skeptical judges. But Evelyn knew better. It wasn't just personal grit, it was faith in humanity's capacity to grow and evolve. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of her advocacy reached farther than anyone anticipated. Cities nationwide implemented reforms inspired by the Accountability and Equity Act. Police departments adopted stricter protocols for traffic stops, requiring officers to document their reasoning and provide video evidence when possible. Community oversight boards gained traction, giving citizens a voice in holding law enforcement accountable. Schools introduced new curricula focused on civil rights history, ensuring students understood the struggles and triumphs that paved the way for modern freedoms. Even corporations joined the movement, pledging millions toward diversity initiatives and workplace equity programs. Tech giants launched campaigns to close racial wage gaps, while retail chains committed to hiring practices that prioritized inclusivity. Though critics argued these efforts were performative, Evelyn saw them as steps in the right direction. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said during a panel discussion, "but every step counts, no matter how small." As for Officer Riggs, his journey took a different path. After being stripped of his badge and facing widespread condemnation, he disappeared from the public eye for a time. Rumors swirled about where he'd gone and what he was doing, but few cared enough to investigate. That is, until a local newspaper published a profile piece titled "Learning from Failure: A Former Cop's Quest for Redemption." The article revealed that Riggs had moved to a small town several states away, where he worked odd jobs to make ends meet. He enrolled in community college, studying criminal justice with a focus on ethics and accountability. At first, his classmates were wary of him, given his past, but over time, they warmed to his genuine desire to learn and improve. One professor described Riggs as a man haunted by regret but driven by hope. "I don't expect forgiveness," Riggs told the reporter. "What I did was wrong, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I'm trying to become someone better, not just for me, but for everyone I hurt along the way." His transformation wasn't without challenges. Some former colleagues dismissed his efforts as insincere, accusing him of seeking redemption for selfish reasons. Others praised his willingness to confront his mistakes, seeing it as proof that growth was possible even for those who caused harm. Regardless of opinions, Riggs's story served as a reminder that accountability and self-reflection could lead to meaningful change. Back in Evelyn's hometown, the community came together to celebrate the progress made in the wake of the incident. Local leaders unveiled a mural honoring Judge Carter, depicting her standing tall against a backdrop of scales of justice and blooming flowers. The artwork quickly became a landmark, drawing visitors from neighboring towns who wanted to pay tribute to her legacy. At the unveiling ceremony, Evelyn stood before a cheering crowd, visibly moved by the outpouring of love and gratitude. She thanked everyone for their hard work and dedication, emphasizing that the fight for justice required collective effort. "This mural isn't just about me," she said, gesturing to the vibrant painting. "It's about all of us, the countless individuals who refuse to accept inequality, who demand fairness, and who believe in a brighter future. Let this be a reminder that we are stronger together." As the sun set on the event, casting golden hues over the gathering, Evelyn reflected on the long road ahead. She knew racism and discrimination wouldn't vanish overnight. They were deeply rooted issues that demanded vigilance and persistence. Still, she found solace in knowing that the seeds of change had been planted, and that each new generation would inherit the responsibility to nurture them. Years later, historians would look back on this period as a turning point in America's ongoing struggle for equality. They'd highlight Evelyn Carter's courage, Daniel Riggs's redemption arc, and the countless unsung heroes who fought tirelessly for progress. But for now, Evelyn chose to focus on the present, to cherish the victories won and prepare for the battles yet to come. One evening, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, Evelyn flipped through an old photo album filled with memories from her decades-long career. There were pictures of her graduating from law school, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, and standing beside civil rights icons at historic marches. Each image told a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and triumph. Closing the album, Evelyn gazed out at the horizon, feeling a profound sense of peace. She thought about the young activists carrying the torch forward, the officers striving to rebuild trust, and the communities working hand in hand to create a fairer world. Though the journey was far from over, she felt confident that humanity was moving in the right direction. And so, Judge Evelyn Carter continued to live her life with the same quiet dignity that defined her throughout the years. Her legacy wasn't just etched in court rulings or monuments. It lived on in the hearts of those she inspired to dream bigger, fight harder, and never give up on the pursuit of justice. For Evelyn, that was the greatest reward of all.